Hey guys, tonight we are diving headfirst into the surprisingly convoluted, often bizarre, and occasionally terrifying world of Victorian sleep aids and remedies. Imagine, if you will, the flickering gaslight casting long dancing shadows across your intricately patterned wallpaper. You've just finished a heavy supper, perhaps a roast followed by several puddings all washed down with a robust porter. The clock in the hall chimes 11, and a pervasive, bone-deep weariness settles over you. But as you climb into your vast, perhaps slightly drafty four-poster bed, your mind refuses to quiet. Thoughts race the demands of the factory, the endless social calls, the oppressive moral strictures of the age. Sleep, this most natural of human necessities, feels impossibly far away. You probably won't survive the boredom of hearing about this, let alone the lack of sleep the Victorians endured. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're up for it, drop a comment with your location and what time it is for you right now. It's always fascinating to see how far these sleepy whispers travel. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. As you settle deeper into your pillow, let your mind drift back to an age brimming with contradictions. The Victorian era, a time of astounding technological progress and rigid societal norms, presented a curious paradox when it came to something as fundamental as sleep. On one hand, rest was revered, seen as essential for physical and moral regeneration. Proverbs like, "Early to bed, early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise," weren't just catchy rhymes, they were ingrained principles of daily life. You were expected to be industrious, to apply yourself with vigor, and to wake refreshed, ready to conquer the day's tasks. Yet despite this societal embrace of sleep as a virtue, the Victorians seemed to struggle profoundly with actually achieving it. Insomnia, or sleeplessness as it was more commonly known, became a pervasive complaint, a silent epidemic that haunted the gaslit nights of an entire generation. You might find yourself wondering why, in an era before smartphones and always-on notifications, sleep became such an elusive prize. The answer, as with many historical phenomena, is multifaceted, reflecting the seismic shifts occurring across society. The Industrial Revolution. A monstrous engine of change was perhaps the most significant culprit. As factories belched smoke and steam, churning out goods at unprecedented rates, they also shattered the ancient rhythms of human existence. For centuries, life had largely revolved around the sun's cycle, dictating work hours by natural light. But now, with gas light and eventually electric light beginning to pierce the darkness, work could and often did continue around the clock. Imagine living next to a textile mill, the ceaseless clatter of looms echoing through your thin walls, or the shriek of a train whistle piercing the quiet of the pre-dawn hours. Your internal clock, attuned to the gentle ebb and flow of nature, was suddenly in a head-on collision with the relentless march of industrial progress. Sleep, which had once been a natural endpoint to a day of physical labor under the sun, transformed into a battle fought against noise, artificial light, and the sheer relentless pace of modern life. Beyond the clamor of industry, the burgeoning cities themselves became hives of sleeplessness. Urbanization brought unprecedented population density, and with it a cacophony of new sounds. Street vendors hawked their wares at all hours. Carriages rattled over cobblestones, and the general hum of thousands, then millions of lives crammed into close quarters meant true silence was a rare luxury. You might complain about your neighbor's late-night gaming, but imagine the sound of a full-scale locomotive rattling past your bedroom window. Talk about a rude awakening, literally. This constant sensory assault, coupled with poorer ventilation, cramped living conditions, and often questionable sanitation, created environments far from conducive to restful slumber. It was a sensory overload that your ancestors living in quieter rural settings simply hadn't experienced. Then there were the social and moral pressures that bore down on the Victorian psyche, adding another layer to their nocturnal anxieties. This was an age obsessed with propriety, self-improvement, and what was often termed earnestness. Idleness was not just frowned upon, it was practically a moral failing. Every waking moment was to be utilized for productive work, spiritual reflection, or social engagement. The idea of truly relaxing, of letting your mind wander without purpose, felt almost sinful. Sleeping in was practically a revolutionary act. One imagines stern glances from neighbors if your curtains weren't open by, say, 6 a.m. sharp. This pervasive ethos meant that even when you could sleep, you might feel a lingering guilt, a sense that you were squandering precious productive hours. It was a bizarre twist, the very society that demanded so much from its citizens, then subtly shamed them for the essential rest they needed to cope. And let's not forget the Victorian diet. If you think your late night pizza gives you heartburn, imagine a Victorian supper. You'd need a stomach of cast iron and a digestive system powered by sheer willpower. Heavy, rich foods often consumed late in the evening, combined with liberal consumption of alcohol, from fortified wines to robust porters and brandies, certainly didn't pave the way for a serene night's rest. You might find yourself tossing and turning not just from the day's anxieties, but from the sheer digestive effort required to process your evening meal. The medical understanding of how diet impacted sleep was at best rudimentary. Advice often veered into the realm of folk wisdom, mixed with pseudoscientific notions. This brings us to the emerging medical understanding of sleep and its disturbances. While the concept of sleep has existed since humanity began, the Victorians began to formalize insomnia as a distinct medical complaint rather than just a natural state of wakefulness. As the stresses of modern life mounted, so too did the complaints of nerves, nervous exhaustion, and hysteria, particularly among women. Insomnia was often seen as a key symptom of these broader maladies, a sign that the delicate human machine was overtaxed. A Victorian doctor faced with a sleepless patient might suggest a brisk walk in the graveyard or perhaps a nice cup of boiled leeches. Modern medicine thankfully has moved on, mostly. The idea that mental strain could directly impact physical rest was gaining traction, though the solutions were often as much about moral correction as medical intervention. It was during this period that the seeds of modern sleep science were slowly, almost imperceptibly being sown. Though still steeped in the old humoral theories and anecdotal observations, physicians and domestic manual writers began to compile lists of causes and potential remedies for sleeplessness. They recognized factors like noise, light worry, and digestive upset. But their understanding was still largely superficial, lacking the physiological insights we take for granted today. They knew something was wrong, but they didn't quite know why or how to fix it scientifically. Think of the sensory environment of a Victorian bedroom at night. The soft glow of a gas lamp often left burning low in the hall, or even the room for reassurance against the darkness. The creaking of floorboards in an old house, the distant clip-clop of horse-drawn carriages, the mournful cry of a night watchman calling out the hours. It wasn't the silent, dark, temperature-controlled sanctuary we aspire to today. Instead, it was a space permeated by the outside world, a constant, subtle reminder that the world kept turning, even if you couldn't keep up with its restful rhythm. They had gadgets for everything except maybe a remote control for your dreams, which, let's be honest, would probably just project an accountant doing taxes. One particularly quirky tidbit from the era revolves around the concept of moral sleep. Some educators and moralists argued that excessive sleep was a sign of weakness, even depravity. You were meant to rise early, refreshed for your duties, but not too refreshed, lest you be accused of indulging in idleness. There were even theories that too much sleep could lead to a flabby mind and a decline in moral fiber. This kind of thinking pushed many to shorten their sleep, sometimes deliberately believing it was a mark of strength and character to require less rest. It's almost as if they were trying to gaslight themselves into not needing sleep. Historians still argue whether the Victorians genuinely suffered more from insomnia or simply began to label it as a distinct medical problem more frequently. It's a fascinating chicken or egg scenario. Did the relentless pace and new stresses of industrial life genuinely increase the incidence of sleeplessness? Or did the emerging medical profession simply create a new category for a problem that had always existed but was previously accepted as a natural variation in human rest patterns? The truth, as often is the case, probably lies somewhere in the middle. The conditions of the era undeniably made sleep harder to come by for many, but the growing awareness and the medicalization of insomnia certainly brought it into the public consciousness in a new way. The very act of giving it a name made it a problem to be solved rather than just an occasional inconvenience. So, as you can see, the stage was set. The Victorians, caught between their rigid moral codes and the dizzying pace of change, found themselves increasingly adrift on a sea of sleepless nights. They were exhausted, anxious, and desperate for a solution. And where there's desperation, there's always a market for remedies, whether they were truly effective or merely offered a comforting illusion of control. In the coming narrative, you'll discover the ingenious, the bizarre, and the sometimes downright dangerous ways they sought to reclaim the elusive gift of slumber. So, with the night stretching long and sleep stubbornly refusing to make an appearance, where did a respectable Victorian initially turn for solace? Before the chemist's shops overflowed with brightly labeled elixirs, promising instant oblivion before the widespread embrace of the more potent and often perilous concoctions. We'll discuss the first line of defense against sleeplessness lay closer to home. You'd probably rummage through your kitchen pantry, perhaps consult a well-worn domestic manual, or most likely simply ask your grandmother. This was the era of gentle traditional home remedies, the kind passed down through generations, steeped in folk wisdom and the comforting rituals of hearth and home. Imagine yourself in a Victorian kitchen, not unlike your own, but perhaps with a larger array of dried herbs hanging from the rafters. The air might smell faintly of lavender, or perhaps a more pungent, earthy aroma. When sleep proved elusive, the first thought often drifted to nature's pharmacy. Herbal infusions were paramount. You'd find yourself brewing a cup of something warm, hoping its subtle properties would lull you into slumber. Chamomile, that unassuming daisy-like flower, was a perennial favorite. Its gentle sedative properties were widely known, and its preparation was simple dried flowers steeped in hot water, perhaps with a spoonful of honey. It's the kind of thing your great-great-grandmother might have given you, and frankly, it's still a staple in modern tea aisles. Some things, it seems, never truly go out of style. But chamomile was just the tip of the herbal iceberg. You might also encounter valerian, a root with a distinctly musky aroma that earned it the moniker nature's Valium. Its efficacy was and still is a subject of some debate among herbalists, but the Victorians swore by its calming effects. Then there was lavender, not just for its delightful fragrance, but also for its reputed ability to soothe jangled nerves when prepared as a tea. Lime blossom too often found its way into evening infusions lauded for its mild sedative qualities. And for those truly desperate for a good night's rest, hops, yes, the same hops that give beer its distinctive bitter flavor, were sometimes used. You wouldn't be brewing a pint, mind you, but rather a strong bitter tea, or even stuffing dried hops into a pillow, allowing their purported soporific vapors to work their magic as you drifted off. One can only imagine the faces of Victorian children being offered some of these bitter brews. Drink this, darling. It tastes like... well, it tastes like it's working. You'd probably have more success convincing a modern toddler to eat kale raw. Beyond the herbal concoctions, the Victorians often sought comfort in simple warm libations. Warm milk, a remedy so ancient it likely predates the Victorians by millennia, was a go-to. Its comforting warmth and the presence of tryptophan, an amino acid, precursor to serotonin and melatonin, though they wouldn't have known that, of course, made it a popular choice. But it wasn't just milk. Warm broths, gruel, a thin porridge often made from oats or other grains, and even thin, weak soups were sometimes prescribed as light, easily digestible evening meals, meant to settle the stomach without overburdening the digestive system. The logic was sound, even if the flavor profile might leave something to be desired. If you spent your day toiling in a factory or navigating the rigid social structures, a bowl of bland gruel might just be the most exciting thing you'd experience after sunset, and perhaps that very lack of excitement was supposed to help you sleep. Physical comforts also played a significant role in the Victorian quest for slumber. The idea of a warm bath before bed is hardly revolutionary, but the Victorians understood its relaxing properties. A long soak, perhaps with a few drops of lavender oil if you were fancy, or just plain hot water, was often recommended to soothe tired muscles and calm the mind. Foot baths, too, were popular, drawing blood away from the head and promoting a sense of overall relaxation. For those with particularly agitated minds, Cold compresses applied to the forehead or temples were believed to reduce feverish thoughts and bring a sense of cool relief. You might even find advice on placing a hot brick wrapped in flannel at the foot of your bed to ward off the chill in drafty, poorly heated bedrooms. A true test of commitment to comfort and possibly an occupational hazard if you weren't careful. Beyond the remedies themselves, there was an emphasis on creating a conducive sleep environment, rudimentary though their understanding of sleep hygiene might have been. They weren't exactly touting blackout curtains and white noise machines, but common sense prevailed. Advice often included ensuring the bedroom was dark and quiet, keeping the air fresh by opening a window even in winter if you were brave, and avoiding stimulating activities before bed. Of course, quiet in a bustling Victorian city was a relative term. While you might seek the gentle hum of a fan for background noise, a Victorian might just get the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer or the rumble of a late-night omnibus. Trying to achieve peace and quiet in a noisy Victorian home must have been akin to trying to meditate at a rock concert. Just relax, darling. Your spouse might whisper as a horse-drawn carriage thunders past your window, shaking the very foundations of your home. The true efficacy of many of these home remedies lay not just in their inherent pharmacological properties, which were often mild at best, but in the powerful psychological comfort they offered. The ritual itself, the act of preparing a soothing drink or settling into a warm bath, provided a mental transition from the day's anxieties to the expectation of rest. It was a tangible effort to invite sleep, a moment of quiet introspection in a chaotic world. When a parent offered a child a warm cup of milk and a gentle bedtime story, the reassurance and routine likely contributed more to slumber than any chemical compound. It was a placebo effect of the purest kind, reinforced by generations of belief and loving care. Historians debate the true efficacy of these gentle remedies, questioning whether placebo effect or genuine pharmacology was at play. While modern science can confirm some mild sedative properties in chamomile and valerian, for example, the potency was often low and the preparation methods inconsistent. Was it the herb itself or the belief in the herb that truly offered relief? It's difficult to separate the two, especially when you consider that many people likely didn't suffer from severe chronic insomnia, but rather occasional restless nights exacerbated by life's stresses. For them, a warm drink and a quiet moment might have been enough. The scientific precision of grandmother's recipes, which often involved a pinch of this and a splash of that, probably left a lot to be desired in terms of consistent dosage. Despite their often limited pharmacological punch, these remedies were immensely popular because they were accessible. You didn't need a doctor's prescription or a trip to a distant chemist. Many herbs could be grown in a small garden patch or foraged from the countryside. Milk water and basic grains were staples. This democratized the search for sleep-making relief, or at least the attempt at it, available to all social strata, not just the wealthy who could afford specialist medical advice. This was a significant mainstream historical fact, the reliance on common, readily available garden herbs and household ingredients as the primary form of medicine for everyday ailments, including sleeplessness for the vast majority of the population. However, despite the comforting rituals and mild benefits, these gentle remedies often proved insufficient for the deeper, more pervasive sleep problems that were emerging in Victorian society. When the anxieties of the industrial age truly took hold, when the body felt genuinely fatigued, but the mind refused to quiet, a cup of chamomile tea might feel about as effective as trying to put out a bonfire with a squirt gun. It was like trying to solve a complex engineering problem with a rubber band. You needed something stronger, something that promised a more immediate, more profound oblivion. And as the demand for such solutions grew, a new, often unregulated industry rose to meet it, offering potent concoctions that promised much but often delivered unforeseen consequences. Your sleepy journey through Victorian history is just beginning, and we're about to step into a much more dubious and certainly more dangerous pharmacy. You've just peered into the chaotic bazaar of Victorian patent medicines, where glittering promises masked dubious ingredients. But among that riot of tonics and elixirs, one substance reigned supreme, an unassuming brown liquid that flowed through the veins of Victorian society with astonishing ubiquity laudanum. It was the era's undisputed champion of quietude, a liquid lullaby that promised sweet dreams, but as you'll soon discover, often delivered a waking nightmare. So what exactly was this ubiquitous potion? In its simplest form, laudanum was a tincture of opium in alcohol. Imagine raw opium derived from the poppy plant dissolved in a solution of ethanol, essentially opium-infused booze. It usually appeared as a reddish-brown liquid, bitter to the taste but remarkably effective at dulling pain, suppressing coughs, stopping diarrhea, and most pertinent to our sleepy journey, inducing a profound sense of calm and sleep. It might not look like much, just a small bottle of dark liquid, but its power to alter consciousness was immense. And here's the truly astonishing part, it was everywhere. More common perhaps than your morning coffee is today, or at least as readily available as a bottle of whiskey. You could purchase laudanum with remarkable ease. There was no prescription required. None. You simply walked into an apothecary, a grocer's shop, a general store in a remote village, or even flagged down a street vendor and bought a bottle off the shelf. It was cheap too, making it accessible to virtually all social classes, from the destitute factory worker seeking respite from constant aches to the genteel lady of leisure attempting to quiet her nerves. Imagine trying to buy powerful opioids over the counter today. Your local pharmacist would probably call the police or at least give you a stern lecture. But for the Victorians, it was as commonplace as buying sugar or flour. A pint of milk, a loaf of bread, and a dram of laudanum for dear Aunt Mildred, please. It sounds like a joke, but it was their everyday reality. The sheer range of applications for laudanum contributed massively to its pervasive grip on society. For physical ailments, it was a miracle worker. Got a toothache laudanum, persistent cough laudanum, the dreadful cholera morbus, or simply a nasty bout of diarrhea laudanum. Chronic pain from a workplace injury or lingering illness laudanum. It was the go-to analgesic, the all-purpose sedative. And for the overwhelming anxieties of Victorian life, for those nervous complaints and the rampant sleeplessness we explored, it offered an immediate, profound escape. You swallowed a few drops or perhaps a teaspoon, and the world's sharp edges began to blur. Your racing thoughts slowed, your agitated nerves calmed, and soon a heavy, irresistible drowsiness would claim you. For those desperately seeking sleep, it was the answer to a prayer, a sweet, soporific grip that promised blissful oblivion. This widespread acceptance was fueled by a fundamental misunderstanding of addiction. The concept of opiate dependence as a disease, as something truly damaging to the body and mind, was largely absent. Instead, a persistent need for laudanum was often simply dismissed as a habit, a nervous condition, or a sign of moral weakness rather than a physiological dependency. If you felt unwell without your daily dose, it wasn't because you were addicted. It was simply because your nerves were acting up and naturally more laudanum was the cure. It was a vicious cycle often unknowingly perpetuated by users and even some medical professionals. Oh dear, you're feeling fidgety and anxious, you must be overworked. Here, have a little more of this calming tonic. One of the most sobering and frankly shocking uses of laudanum was its application to children. Soothing syrups for infants designed to quiet crying babies almost invariably contained significant amounts of opium or morphine, often mixed with alcohol. A mother exhausted by her child's incessant wails could administer a few drops, and within minutes the baby would fall into a deep, unnaturally quiet sleep. This brought immense relief to struggling parents, but it also led to countless accidental overdoses and tragically a generation of children unknowingly exposed to opiate dependence from infancy. Imagine being a Victorian parent desperately trying to cope, and a cheerful advertisement tells you this syrup will make your baby sleep through the night. You'd probably jump at the chance, completely unaware of the underlying danger. It makes modern parenting debates about screen time or sugar feel positively quaint. The sheer lack of standardization in laudanum preparation further exacerbated the dangers. Without regulated manufacturing processes, the potency of laudanum could vary wildly from one batch to another, or from one apothecary to the next. What was a safe dose from one chemist might be a fatal overdose from another. Accidental poisonings were distressingly common, often dismissed as unfortunate accidents, or attributed to underlying health issues. A good night's sleep could mean several hours of oblivion, or it could mean something far more permanent. There was no warning label, No dosage recommendations based on body weight, just a hope and a prayer. Historians continue to debate the true scale of opiate dependence during this era, given the casual nature of its use and the lack of comprehensive records. It's incredibly difficult to ascertain exactly how many Victorians were functionally addicted, as their symptoms might have been attributed to other illnesses or simply normalized as a habit. The middle and upper classes often preferred laudanum, sometimes seen as more genteel than a drunken stupor. Working class women facing immense hardship and stress found it a cheap and accessible escape. Poets and writers seeking inspiration or simply relief from sensitive nerves openly chronicled their use. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the famous romantic poet, famously grappled with opium addiction, and his struggles often served as a grim testament to its power, even if his peers didn't always fully grasp the nature of his affliction. A particularly quirky tidbit is the concept of opium parties, or social gatherings where individuals would partake in controlled doses of laudanum, sometimes as a form of intellectual stimulation or shared experience. While not as common as the individual private use for ailments, these instances highlight the deeply ingrained social acceptance of opium as a recreational as well as medicinal substance. It's hard to imagine inviting your friends over for a nice cup of opiate-infused alcohol, but for some Victorians it was just another form of entertainment, alongside a rousing game of charades. This widespread use of laudanum as a mainstream historical fact profoundly shaped Victorian society. It quieted the pain, it muted the anxiety, and it undoubtedly provided sleep for millions. But it came at a terrible cost. The very solution to their sleeplessness often became a new, more formidable problem. The foggy mornings, the subtle withdrawal symptoms, the increasing tolerance, and the desperate need for more, these were the unseen chains forged by the liquid lullaby. As you drift closer to understanding this pervasive drug, you begin to grasp the precarious balance of their lives, where relief was often just a step away from ruin. The next part of our journey will plunge deeper into the darker side of this relationship, exploring the burgeoning problem of opiate addiction and its grim societal impact. It's a descent from soothing relief into the true shadows of dependency. You've seen how laudanum, that unassuming brown liquid, flowed so freely through Victorian society, promising sweet release from pain and the elusive gift of sleep. But as you can probably anticipate, what began as a seemingly benign convenience, a simple household remedy, inevitably cast a lengthening shadow. The very relief it offered soon morphed into an insidious trap, as the dawn of widespread opiate addiction quietly emerged from the comforting folds of societal acceptance. Initially, as we discussed, the Victorians didn't conceptualize addiction as we do today. They didn't have the scientific understanding of neurological dependence. If you found yourself irritable, anxious, and physically unwell without your daily dose of laudanum, it wasn't because you were addicted. You simply had bad nerves, wahia, or perhaps your constitution was delicate. The solution: why another dose of your soothing tonic, of course. This circular logic perpetuated the problem, allowing dependence to flourish unnoticed, or at least unacknowledged as the grave medical condition it was. Trying to explain modern withdrawal symptoms to a Victorian doctor might have been like trying to teach a cat quantum physics. Utterly baffling and likely to result in a blank stare, perhaps followed by a recommendation for a bloodletting. But as the decades wore on and more people found themselves unable to function without their regular dram or drop, the physical and mental tolls became undeniable. Prolonged opiate use, even in relatively small doses, had a cumulative effect. You'd notice a persistent lethargy, a dulling of the senses, a pervasive constipation that became a significant health issue in itself, and often a gradual emaciation as your appetite dwindled. The once bright eyes of a person seeking relief might become clouded. Their movements slowed, their once sharp wit blunted. It wasn't just physical. The psychological dependence was equally crushing. The crushing anxiety, the overwhelming craving, the feeling that your very being depended on that next dose. These were the true chains, largely invisible to the outside world, yet fiercely binding. And then there were the withdrawal symptoms. Ah, the unspeakable agony that made escape from the opiate's grip so terrifyingly difficult. Imagine your worst flu magnified tenfold, then mixed with a severe anxiety attack and restless leg syndrome that makes you want to crawl out of your skin. This wasn't just bad nerves. This was your body screaming in protest as it was deprived of the chemical it had come to rely upon. Chills, fever, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, muscle cramps, excruciating bone pain, profound depression, and a terrifying inability to sleep. The very thing you started taking it for would descend upon you. This unbearable suffering was often the most compelling reason to continue use, regardless of the desire to quit. The immediate agonizing reality of withdrawal was enough to keep millions tethered to their habit, a silent daily torment. As the problem escalated, a subtle social stigma began to emerge, though it was by no means universal. While a genteel lady might still discreetly take her nervous tonic, the working classes, especially men who used opium to dull the pain of grueling labor, often faced harsher judgment. The image of the opium eater, often associated with poverty or the exoticized Oriental, began to take root in the public imagination, influencing literature and art. You might see depictions of gaunt, disheveled figures, their lives seemingly wasted away by the drug. Yet for many, opiates remained an essential crutch against the relentless grind of poverty, overwork, and chronic illness in an era with limited social safety nets and even fewer effective pain management solutions. When your choices are unbearable pain or a few pennies for oblivion, the choice isn't really a choice at all. This era also saw the rise or at least the popularization of opium dens, particularly associated with Chinese immigrants who arrived in Western countries during the 19th century. While smoking opium in a den was a far cry from discreetly sipping laudanum in a Victorian drawing room, these establishments nonetheless captured the public imagination and fueled fears of illicit drug use. They became symbols of vice and foreign corruption, further contributing to the negative, though often misdirected perception of opium. For a Victorian lady quietly taking her spoonful of laudanum at home, the image of a smoky, dim opium den felt a world away, yet they were both engaging with the same fundamental chemical. It's almost as if the opium den was the original Netflix and chill, for some, but with much higher stakes and considerably less binge watching. As the scale of the problem became impossible to ignore, there were feeble, often misguided attempts at regulation. Early pharmacy acts might have required pharmacists to label poisonous substances, but this was a far cry from comprehensive control. Some tried to restrict sales, but the sheer volume of products containing opiates made enforcement a nightmare. Manufacturers, meanwhile, were adept at skirting nascent regulations, simply renaming their products or subtly altering formulas. You might see advertisements for addiction cures, but the cheeky joke here is that many of these cures were simply weaker doses of opiates, or even just more of the same designed to manage withdrawal symptoms rather than truly break the dependence. It was an entrepreneurial pyramid scheme built on suffering. This period then represents a critical mainstream historical fact. Despite its widespread initial acceptance, the Victorian era saw the gradual, though incomplete, recognition of opiate addiction as a serious social and medical problem. This realization didn't happen overnight, nor was it a neat, linear progression. It was messy, fraught with moral judgments, class biases, and a profound lack of scientific understanding. The very phrase, opium eater, once a neutral description, began to acquire increasingly negative connotations, signaling a shift in how society viewed habitual users. Scholars still debate the prevailing societal attitudes towards opiate users, questioning whether pity or moral condemnation was the dominant response and how this varied by class. Was the poor factory worker who self-medicated for pain seen with the same empathy as the nervous society lady who couldn't sleep? Likely not. There was a tendency to pathologize the other, the Chinese opium smoker, the working class addict, while often excusing or overlooking dependents in the middle and upper classes as a sign of their delicate constitution. It was a convenient way to maintain social order while ignoring the systemic issues that drove many to seek chemical solace. One particularly poignant and quirky tidbit comes from personal diaries and letters of the time. You find accounts of individuals, often women, attempting to secretly reduce their laudanum intake, suffering immensely in solitude, ashamed of a habit they couldn't control. They would measure out ever decreasing drops or switch to a less potent, though still opiate containing alternative. Their silent struggles a testament to the isolating power of dependence in an age that offered little support. Imagine the sheer mental fortitude required to go through opiate withdrawal in a drafty Victorian house with no medical assistance and the constant fear of discovery. You'd almost prefer a polite conversation with a ghost. Their bottles, unlike modern pharmaceuticals with their comprehensive warnings, bore little more than a name and a dose recommendation, sometimes just as needed. The idea of a detailed side effects leaflet would probably have made a Victorian faint. The shadow of the opiate then stretched long over Victorian society. What began as a desperate plea for sleep and pain relief evolved into a complex web of dependence misunderstanding and burgeoning social concern. While laudanum continued its pervasive reign for decades, its darker side was becoming increasingly apparent. But as some began to shy away from its potent embrace, what other avenues did the sleepless Victorians pursue? As you continue your gentle descent into this historical slumber, you'll discover that the scientific and medical community, despite its limitations, was starting to look beyond the poppy, exploring other potent and sometimes equally dangerous sedatives to calm the agitated mind. As you might have guessed, the Victorian quest for sleep didn't end with the bittersweet embrace of laudanum. Even as the shadow of opiate addiction began to darken the landscape, the relentless march of scientific discovery, or perhaps more accurately daring experimentation, was opening new, equally potent, and arguably more perilous avenues for chemical oblivion. Our focus now shifts from the poppy's gentle yet insidious grip to the sharp, sweet scent of newly discovered chemical compounds chloroform and ether. These substances burst onto the medical scene in the mid-19th century as revolutionary surgical anesthetics. Imagine the horror of pre-anesthetic surgery, the screams, the desperate struggle, the sheer brutality of it all. So when doctors like James Young Simpson introduced chloroform in 1847, allowing patients to undergo agonizing procedures in a blissful state of unconsciousness, it was hailed as nothing short of a miracle. Ether had been discovered earlier in the 1840s, and its anesthetic properties were also recognized, but chloroform, with its faster action and more pleasant smell, quickly gained favor. For the first time, patients could face the surgeon's knife without experiencing the excruciating pain. It truly changed medicine forever. But as with so many powerful discoveries, its application soon extended far beyond the operating theater. You see, if these chemicals could induce profound unconsciousness for surgery, surely they could also induce a good night's sleep for the desperately sleepless Victorian. The logic, though flawed, was alluringly simple. The way they worked in a simplified sense was by depressing the central nervous system, effectively slowing down brain activity to the point of sedation or even full unconsciousness. You'd administer it by simply pouring a few drops onto a handkerchief or a piece of cloth and inhaling the vapors. The immediate sensation was often a dizzying euphoria, a disorienting giddiness before a heavy, almost overwhelming drowsiness would descend. For someone tossing and turning haunted by anxieties, the promise of such rapid, decisive oblivion must have seemed incredibly attractive. However, the dangers of using chloroform and ether as casual sleep aids were profound and terrifying. Unlike laudanum, which could be ingested, and its effects, though slow, were generally more predictable. Drop by drop, these inhalants offered a much narrower margin between sedation and death. Too much or too quickly, and you risked respiratory depression where your breathing simply slowed to a halt. Cardiac arrest was also a very real possibility, particularly with chloroform, which could cause heart arrhythmias. Accidental overdoses were tragically common, often leading to sudden, irreversible fatalities. It was a perilous game of chemical roulette with your life on the line. Imagine asking your doctor today for a small bottle of chloroform to help you sleep. They'd probably call for immediate psychiatric evaluation, or at least a very firm no before escorting you gently from the premises. Despite these terrifying risks, there was a period of social acceptance. fueled by the initial wonder at their anesthetic properties and a general lack of understanding of their physiological effects. The public, often captivated by scientific marvels, saw these substances as modern wonders. And if the queen herself used it, it must be safe. Right. A truly significant mainstream historical fact that cemented chloroform's respectability and widespread adoption was Queen Victoria's use of it during the birth of her eighth child, Prince Leopold, in 1853. Dr. John Snow, a pioneer in anesthesiology, administered the chloroform, effectively sanctioning its use for pain relief during childbirth. This royal endorsement made chloroform seem not just safe, but even genteel. It effectively shattered the moral objections to pain relief during labor, giving women a measure of comfort previously unthinkable. You can almost hear the excited chatter. If it's good enough for Her Majesty, it's certainly good enough for my restless nights. Beyond medicinal use, a quirky and alarming fringe tidbit of the era saw a brief daring flirtation with recreational use. Ether frolics, or chloroform parties, occasionally occurred, particularly among medical students or daring young adults seeking new thrills. You'd gather with friends, pass around a bottle, and inhale the intoxicating vapors, experiencing moments of giddy exhilaration, disinhibition, and often brief unconsciousness. It was like a very dangerous, very sleepy version of Spin the Bottle. One can only imagine the sheer chaos and peril of such gatherings where individuals were literally passing out from inhaling industrial chemicals. The smell alone, chloroform has a sweet, somewhat cloying odor, while ether is more pungent and metallic. Must have been overwhelming. Forget your scented candles for relaxation. These folks were getting high on the equivalent of industrial solvents. The contrast with opiates was striking. While opiates offered a slow creeping sedation that could be sustained, chloroform and ether provided a rapid, all-encompassing blackout. The high was different too, less about euphoria and more about immediate detachment and a temporary release from consciousness. The withdrawal profile was also different, less the prolonged agony of opiate withdrawal, but often marked by confusion, nausea, and general malaise if chronic use developed. However, the immediate risk of death was far higher with these inhalants. Medical historians continue to debate the full extent of public awareness regarding the profound dangers of these inhalants when used outside of supervised medical settings. While the medical community quickly learned about the precise dosages and risks within a hospital context, the general public, armed with a bottle purchased from a chemist, often lacked this critical knowledge. How many genuinely understood that a few extra drops could mean the difference between sleep and a permanent state of repose? It's likely that the allure of immediate relief overshadowed a clear understanding of the potentially fatal consequences. It was a time of immense scientific optimism and perhaps a dangerous underestimation of the power of these new chemical tools. As the century progressed and more was learned about the physiological effects of these substances, their use as casual sleep aids began to wane. The risks were simply too apparent, the accidents too frequent. Safer, albeit still problematic alternatives eventually emerged. The Victorian era, in its desperate search for rest, truly pushed the boundaries of self-medication, venturing into realms that now seem utterly reckless. The very bravery or perhaps foolishness of their self-experimentation with such potent chemicals is something to behold. We have so many regulations and warnings on everything now, from aspirin to cold medicine, that the idea of a Victorian reaching for a bottle of chloroform like it was a nighttime cough syrup is almost unfathomable. So while chloroform and ether were revolutionary in surgery, their venture into the realm of everyday sleep aids was a hazardous detour. A stark reminder that not all scientific marvels are meant for casual home use. The fleeting sweetness of their calming embrace often led to far more bitter ends. Having navigated the chemical landscape of the Victorian night, we now turn our attention to an entirely different approach to sleep: the power of the mind and the mysterious, often theatrical world of hypnotism and mesmerism. Could the human will itself be the key to unlocking the elusive gates of slumber? Having journeyed through the unpredictable landscape of Victorian chemical sleep aids, from gentle teas to potent, often lethal inhalants, you might find yourself wondering, was there no other way? No path that didn't involve a bitter potion or a dangerously sweet vapor? Indeed, there was. As the limits and perils of pharmacologically induced slumber became increasingly apparent, some Victorians turned their gaze inward, exploring the mysterious power of the human mind itself. Welcome to the world of mesmerism and hypnotism, where the path to sleep was not through a bottle but through a gaze, a pass of the hand, and the subtle art of suggestion. It was a fascinating, often theatrical attempt to achieve mind over melatonin. The roots of this approach stretch back to the late 18th century to a controversial figure named Franz Mesmer. Though he predates the height of the Victorian era, his theories of animal magnetism, a universal fluid he believed flowed through all living things and which could be manipulated to restore health, laid the groundwork. By the Victorian age, Mesmer's original ideas, while mostly debunked scientifically, had evolved into a popular phenomenon known simply as mesmerism. You'd find mesmerists often with a flair for the dramatic holding at public demonstrations and private sessions, claiming to induce trances, alleviate pain, and yes, coax the sleepless into profound repose. Imagine yourself in a dimly lit Victorian parlor, perhaps at a small gathering or a private consultation. A mesmeric practitioner, often with a piercing gaze, would sit opposite you. They might make slow, deliberate passes with their hands over your body or fix their eyes steadily upon yours. The air would be thick with anticipation, perhaps a nervous cough or two from the onlookers. The goal was to align your magnetic fluid, or more accurately, to induce a state of heightened suggestibility. You'd be instructed to relax, to focus, to let your thoughts drift. The atmosphere was part mystique, part medical consultation, part performance art. It was a far cry from simply brewing a cup of chamomile. This was a full sensory psychological experience. As the 19th century progressed, a Scottish surgeon named James Braid began to refine Mesmer's techniques, stripping away the animal magnetism mumbo-jumbo and focusing on the psychological aspects. In the 1840s, he coined the term hypnotism, derived from the Greek word hypnos for sleep. Braid emphasized the role of focused attention and suggestibility, believing that the hypnotic state was a form of concentrated mental absorption, a kind of induced reverie rather than an external magnetic force. You might be asked to fix your gaze on a swinging pocket watch, a bright object, or a single point on the wall. The practitioner would then speak in a soft, monotonous tone, offering suggestions of relaxation, heaviness, and eventually deep sleep. It was the original mindfulness practice, but with a bit more of a theatrical flourish and a good chance of someone telling you to cluck like a chicken if you weren't careful. For the Victorians, battling insomnia, hypnotism, and mesmerism offered an enticing alternative to the chemical roller coaster. The promise was a natural, drug-free sleep induced simply by the power of suggestion. Practitioners claimed to put patients into a state of profound relaxation, akin to deep sleep from which they would awaken refreshed. This was particularly appealing for those suffering from nervous disorders or hysteria, conditions often linked to sleeplessness and mental agitation. The idea was that the trance state could calm the overactive mind, breaking the cycle of anxious rumination that prevented sleep. It felt more holistic, more spiritual than simply drinking a bottle of opium-laced syrup. However, the public perception of mesmerism and hypnotism was a curious blend of fascination, wonder, and profound skepticism. On one hand, the phenomena could be astonishing. People would sometimes exhibit heightened senses, reduced pain, or even perform actions suggested to them while in a trance. This made for compelling public spectacles. Mesmerists became popular entertainers, drawing crowds who marveled at their subjects' strange behaviors. This theatricality, however, also fueled the skepticism of the mainstream medical establishment, which often dismissed these practices as mere trickery charlatanism, or the result of patient credulity rather than genuine therapeutic effect. It's all in your head, they'd say, without fully grasping that for many that was precisely where the problem began. It was a bizarre kind of Victorian therapy where your sleep coach might just stare intently at you until you passed out. A quirky anecdote illustrating the public's perception comes from contemporary accounts of spontaneous mesmeric trances. People in audiences, or even those merely reading about mesmerism, would sometimes claim to fall into a trance-like state, exhibiting symptoms of sleepiness or altered consciousness. Whether these were genuine or a product of heightened suggestibility and social contagion, it highlights the powerful mystique surrounding these practices. Imagine sitting in a lecture on mesmerism and suddenly feeling your eyelids droop, only to realize you've just inadvertently hypnotized yourself into thinking you're a particularly sleepy poodle. The challenge for historians studying this period, and indeed the central point of scholarly debate, lies in discerning the true mechanisms at play. Scholars still debate the true mechanisms at play in Victorian mesmerism and hypnotism, questioning the extent to which genuine altered states of consciousness were achieved versus elaborate suggestion and showmanship. Was it a genuine therapeutic effect, a deeply relaxed state akin to meditation, or merely a sophisticated form of placebo amplified by the theatrics and the patient's desperate desire for relief? While modern science now recognizes hypnosis as a valid, albeit complex, psychological phenomenon, the Victorians were often operating in a gray area where science, entertainment, and genuine belief intertwined. It's a bit like trying to analyze the effectiveness of a modern spiritual guru without knowing if the audience members are secretly actors. Despite the skepticism and the showmanship, the widespread interest in mesmerism and hypnotism represents a significant mainstream historical fact. They demonstrated an early, if crude, recognition of the mind-body connection in health and disease. They showed that psychological factors could profoundly influence physical states, including the ability to sleep or feel pain. This laid crucial groundwork, even if indirectly, for later developments in psychotherapy, psychosomatic medicine, and our modern understanding of how cognitive and emotional states impact sleep. They proved that the brain wasn't just a physical organ. It had a powerful, subtle influence that could be harnessed, or at least attempted to be harnessed, for healing. However, while mesmerizing gazes and hypnotic suggestions might have offered a drug-free path to slumber, for some, they weren't universally effective. Not everyone was susceptible to the trance, and for those deeply entrenched in chronic insomnia or physical pain, the subtle power of suggestion might simply not have been enough. It was a delicate, nuanced art, not a guaranteed solution. And besides, lying still and being stared at for an hour might have been relaxing for some, but for others it might have felt more like a very quiet, very intense job interview. So while the mind-bending allure of mesmerism and hypnotism offered a fascinating alternative to chemical sedation, the Victorians were nothing if not resourceful. Their quest for sleep wasn't limited to potions or psychological ploys. As you drift further into the history of their restless nights, you'll discover that they also turned to the realm of mechanical ingenuity, creating an array of bizarre and wonderful gadgets designed to literally force slumber upon an unwilling body. Get ready for some truly strange inventions, because sometimes you just needed a machine to tell your brain it was bedtime. You've explored the homegrown herbal cures, the dangerous allure of patent medicines, the mind-bending mystique of mesmerism, and even the cold shock of hydrotherapy. Each path in its own way reflected a desperate yearning for rest. But what happened when all these attempts, whether self-administered or medically prescribed, proved insufficient? When chronic sleeplessness became a debilitating force eroding health and sanity, who did you turn to? This is where our gentle journey takes a turn towards the more structured and often isolated world of Victorian sanitariums, and the surprisingly popular yet often controversial practice of hydrotherapy. You see, after the subtle efficacy of herbal teas, the profound risks of chemical sedatives, and the elusive magic of mind control, the Victorians, in their characteristic blend of optimism and sheer stubbornness, decided to invent their way to a good night's rest. If the body wouldn't sleep, perhaps a machine could make it. This was a time of prolific invention where every problem seemed to invite a mechanical solution. The underlying theory, though often pseudoscientific, was simple. If you could manipulate the physical body, its vibrations, its blood flow, its sensory input, you could somehow trick the brain into switching off. It was less about understanding melatonin and more about hoping a good jiggle or a firm squeeze would do the trick. One category of these fascinating contraptions involved vibration and gentle movement. You might have seen modern massage chairs or even beds that offer subtle vibrations for relaxation. The Victorians were onto something similar, though perhaps less refined. Imagine a vibrating chair, or even a modified bed designed to impart a gentle, rhythmic oscillation to the user. The idea was that this continuous, soothing vibration would relax tense muscles, calm agitated nerves, and lull the user into a state of drowsiness. You'd recline, press a button, or perhaps crank a handle, and the mechanism would begin its soft, persistent hum, intended to mimic the rocking of a cradle. Some even envisioned a sleep-inducing chair that would gently rock back and forth a mechanical nanny for adults. It makes your smart bed's wave massage feature look like a technological leap, but the core concept was there. Then there were the more intrusive and frankly alarming attempts to directly influence the brain. One particularly quirky and fringe tidbit comes in the form of designs for head-compressing devices. The belief based on rudimentary understanding of physiology was that too much blood flow to the brain contributed to mental agitation and sleeplessness. Therefore, if you could gently but firmly compress the head, you might reduce this blood flow, thus calming the mind and inducing sleep. Imagine a helmet-like contraption, perhaps with adjustable straps or pneumatic bladders designed to apply uniform pressure to your skull. You'd strap yourself in, perhaps with a slight groan, hoping this odd embrace would literally squeeze out your worries. It sounds less like a sleep aid and more like a prop from a particularly unsettling horror movie. You'd probably end up with a headache, not a peaceful slumber, and certainly a lot more questions about the inventor's own sleep habits. Beyond direct pressure, some inventors considered controlling the very air you breathed. While full-blown oxygen masks or specific gas delivery systems were largely beyond their domestic capabilities, and thank goodness given the chloroform misadventures, more rudimentary breathing apparatuses were sometimes conceived. These might involve devices designed to regulate respiration, encouraging slow, deep breaths, or even rudimentary masks that filtered or humidified the air, theorized to promote relaxation. Of course, the concept of a Victorian sleep mask often involved inhaling something which, given their track record, was probably best avoided. The Victorian obsession with quiet also spurred a market for ear defenders and sound-dampening devices. While not sleep machines, in the active sense, they were crucial accessories for those living in increasingly noisy urban environments. These could range from simple earplugs made of wax or cotton to more elaborate, perhaps padded headpieces, designed to muffle the relentless clang of industry or the rumble of passing carriages. They were the original noise-canceling headphones, just a little less discreet, and probably a lot less effective than what you wear today. But for someone desperately seeking silence, even a slight reduction in auditory assault was a godsend. A specific, incredibly bizarre patented sleep machine from the late 19th century was a device designed to apply rhythmic pressure to the eyeballs intended to induce sleep. The theory was that the pressure would simulate the feeling of having closed eyes in deep sleep, or perhaps stimulate the vagus nerve, a later scientific understanding. You would position a device with padded cups over your eyelids, and a mechanism would gently press and release, press and release. While the concept sounds utterly horrifying and likely led to more eye strain than sleep, it perfectly encapsulates the boundless, sometimes terrifying ingenuity of the era. It's almost as if the inventor sat down, thought, what's the least comfortable way to fall asleep? And then built that. Historians still debate the true impact and adoption rates of these eccentric inventions, questioning whether they were widely used by the public or remained largely curiosities of the patent office. Were these bizarre bedside gadgets genuinely purchased and used by a significant portion of the population, or were they the niche toys of the wealthy, or simply wild ideas that never quite caught on? It's hard to tell from the surviving records. Many were likely patented but never mass-produced, existing only as drawings or prototypes. Others might have sold a few units to the most desperate and gullible. Perhaps they were the kind of things that got advertised in the back of magazines, nestled between dubious hair tonics and weight loss pills, a testament to the Victorian love for a quick fix, no matter how outlandish. The mainstream historical fact here is that the Victorian era, characterized by an explosion of inventions and a fervent belief in the power of technology, saw numerous attempts to create mechanical devices for health and wellness, some aimed specifically at inducing sleep. It was an age of tinkerers and entrepreneurs, all convinced that every human problem had a mechanical solution waiting to be discovered. From elaborate contraptions for exercise to devices for improving posture, the body was seen as a machine that could be tuned and optimized. Sleep as a function of the body naturally fell under this mechanical gaze. It's almost as if Victorian inventors had too much free time on their hands, or perhaps simply couldn't sleep themselves, and decided to dedicate their waking hours to solving their own nocturnal woes. While many of these gadgets were likely ineffective, perhaps even uncomfortable or dangerous, they speak volumes about the Victorian mindset. They represent a fascinating intersection of burgeoning scientific understanding, unbridled entrepreneurial spirit, and a persistent human longing for a simple solution to a complex problem. You can almost hear the marketing pitch, guaranteed to make you sleep or at least pass out from sheer mechanical frustration. Ultimately, most of these mechanical marvels faded into obscurity, outcompeted by simpler, often chemical remedies that delivered more immediate, if perilous, results. But they stand as a testament to the era's relentless pursuit of rest, even if it meant strapping yourself into a contraption that looked like it belonged in a mad scientist's laboratory rather than a peaceful bedroom. Having explored the wild frontiers of mechanical sleep aids, you're probably realizing that the Victorians left no stone unturned in their quest for slumber. But sometimes the solution isn't about gadgets or potions at all. It's about the very basics of daily life. Our next gentle exploration will take us into the surprisingly detailed and sometimes laughably rigid world of Victorian dietary and lifestyle advice for achieving that elusive good night's rest. Because, as it turns out, what you ate and how you lived might have been just as important as what you swallowed or strapped to your head. You've explored the homegrown herbal cures, the dangerous allure of patent medicines, the mind-bending mystique of mesmerism, and even the clunky ingenuity of sleep gadgets. Each path in its own way reflected a desperate yearning for rest. But what happened when these self-administered remedies and eccentric inventions simply weren't enough? When chronic sleeplessness became a debilitating force, eroding health and sanity, who did you turn to? This is where the evolving figure of the Victorian medical professional stepped in, grappling with the complex dilemma of diagnosing and treating restlessness in an era where scientific understanding of sleep was at best a hazy outline. So, you've navigated the treacherous waters of Victorian chemical sleep aids and explored the dizzying, often baffling world of mechanical sleep aids. You've probably come to the realization that for all their ingenuity, many of these solutions were either dangerous, ineffective, or simply absurd. It begs the question, did the Victorians ever look to simpler, more fundamental changes in their daily lives to find that elusive peace? Indeed, they did. After the frantic pursuit of potions and gadgets, a more sensible holistic approach began to gain traction, largely championed by domestic manuals, physicians, and moralists alike. Welcome to the surprisingly detailed and sometimes laughably rigid world of Victorian dietary and lifestyle advice for achieving better sleep. What we would now call sleep hygiene. You see, long before sleep apps tracked your REM cycles or smart mattresses adjusted to your breathing, the Victorians instinctively understood that your environment and daily habits played a crucial role in whether you slept soundly. Their advice, often presented as strictures for a morally upright life, contained kernels of wisdom that still resonate today. First, let's talk about the bedroom environment. The Victorians were utterly obsessed with fresh air. This was a mainstream historical fact driven by the pervasive, though ultimately incorrect theory of miasmas, the belief that foul odors and stagnant air carried disease. Therefore, ensuring your bedroom was well ventilated was paramount, even if it meant sacrificing warmth. You'd be advised to open your windows even in the depths of winter to allow the poisonous night air, or what they perceived as such, to escape and fresh air to circulate. Imagine trying to sleep with your head literally out the window in a bustling Victorian city, hoping for fresh air, but getting a symphony of horse-drawn carriages, street criers, and the occasional blast of factory steam. It sounds more like a recipe for a cold than a peaceful night's rest. Yet this emphasis on ventilation, while extreme, was a step towards understanding the importance of a well-aired sleeping space. Alongside fresh air, a cool bedroom was often advocated. Overheating was believed to be detrimental to sleep, leading to restless nights and feverish dreams. So you might find yourself snuggled under layers of blankets in a chilly room with the window ajar, hoping the crisp air would carry you to slumber. Your bedding too was a point of meticulous attention. Cleanliness was next to godliness, and clean, dry, well-aired sheets and blankets were essential. Feather beds, though luxurious, were sometimes cautioned against for being too soft or warm, favoring a firmer mattress for proper spinal alignment and cooler sleep. A surprisingly modern take on ergonomics. And, of course, quiet. Despite living in increasingly noisy urban environments, domestic manuals consistently stress the importance of a quiet bedroom, advising against loud conversations, unnecessary movement, or disturbances near the sleeping individual. They probably didn't have specific decibel meters, but the concept was there. Then there was the dietary aspect. A significant callback to our first section. The Victorians understood that heavy, rich meals consumed late in the evening were detrimental to sleep. You'd be encouraged to eat a light supper, avoiding fatty meats, elaborate puddings, and anything that might sit heavily in your stomach. Instead, light broths, thin gruels, remember those, and yes, the ubiquitous warm milk were recommended. If you think your late night snack of ice cream is a bad idea, imagine a Victorian light supper. It might still be a four-course affair by our standards, but relatively lighter for them. The idea was to ease the digestive system, allowing the body to focus on rest, not digestion. However, the advice on alcohol was a bit more nuanced. While often cautioned against in excess a small amount of alcohol, a glass of wine, a small measure of brandy, or a robust porter was sometimes recommended as a sedative before bed. It was seen as a way to calm the nerves and gently usher in drowsiness. The key was moderation, which, as we've seen with laudanum, was often a loose concept in the Victorian era. As for stimulants, strong tea and coffee were generally advised against in the evening. Though coffee wasn't as universally consumed as tea in Britain, if you did partake, you'd be warned that its stimulating properties could interfere with sleep. It's almost ironic their coffee might have been so terrible by modern standards that it was a natural sedative anyway. Moving beyond the bedroom and the dining table, lifestyle choices played a crucial role. Moderate daily exercise was highly encouraged. A brisk walk in the fresh air, a gentle ride on a bicycle once they became popular, or some light gardening were all seen as beneficial for health and, by extension, for sleep. However, intense physical exertion too close to bedtime was cautioned against, as it could overstimulate the body. This is a principle that modern sleep experts wholeheartedly endorse. Perhaps the most universally prescribed piece of advice was the importance of a regular routine. Going to bed and waking up at the same time each day, even on weekends, though the concept of a weekend was still evolving for many, was championed as a way to regulate the body's natural rhythms. This rigid adherence to schedules was very much in keeping with the Victorian emphasis on order and discipline, extending even to the most private corners of one's life. And then there was the mental preparation for sleep. Victorians were frequently advised to avoid exciting books, intense study, or emotional upsets before bed. Reading dull books was often explicitly recommended. Imagine being told, if you want to sleep, dear, pick up this treatise on the proper drainage of sewage. It's bound to bore you into oblivion. It's almost the original sleep podcast, just in printed form and considerably less soothing. Any activity that might overstimulate the brain or lead to anxious rumination was to be avoided. Instead, quiet contemplation, perhaps a short prayer, or a calm conversation was deemed appropriate. The idea was to transition the mind gently from the day's bustle to the quietude of night. This set of comprehensive recommendations, blending environmental adjustments, dietary wisdom, and behavioral routines, represents a significant, mainstream historical fact. Victorian domestic manuals and medical texts frequently advocated for a set of principles related to environment, diet, and daily routine that largely align with modern concepts of sleep hygiene. But while the scientific rationale might have been different miasmas versus circadian rhythms, many of their practical tips were remarkably sound and endure to this day. They were trying to create a deliberate calm, a winding down ritual for a society that was anything but calm. However, historians continue to debate how widely and effectively these sleep hygiene recommendations were adopted by the diverse Victorian populace, given the realities of their living and working conditions. For a wealthy family with a large house, multiple servants and leisure time, implementing these rules was feasible, But for a working class family crammed into a noisy, poorly ventilated tenement with long, exhausting hours of labor and little control over their diet or environment, such advice might have seemed an impossible luxury. Telling a factory worker to avoid mental excitement after a 12-hour shift in a deafening textile mill probably felt like a cruel joke. One particularly quirky piece of advice found in some domestic guides suggested that if you truly couldn't sleep, you should get out of bed, walk around the room briefly, and then return to bed only when truly sleepy. This predates modern cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia CBTI by over a century, which often includes a very similar stimulus control technique. It shows that even amidst the quackery and the bizarre gadgets, there were genuine empirically observed insights into human sleep patterns. So while the Victorians experimented with the dramatic and the dangerous, they also held onto and refined basic common sense practices for encouraging sleep. These principles, rooted in observation and the emerging understanding of health, formed a bedrock of advice that, unlike the addictive potions or head squeezing machines, offered genuine sustainable pathways to better rest. But what happened when these home based remedies, even the sensible ones, weren't enough? Who did you turn to when chronic sleeplessness became a debilitating force? Our next quiet delve will explore the evolving role of the medical professional as doctors began to grapple with sleep as a distinct and complex medical problem. You've explored the homegrown herbal cures, the dangerous allure of patent medicines, the mind bending mystique of mesmerism, and even the clunky ingenuity of sleep gadgets. Each path in its own way reflected a desperate yearning for rest. But what happened when all these attempts, whether self administered or medically prescribed, proved insufficient? When chronic sleeplessness became a debilitating force, eroding health and sanity, who did you turn to? This is where the evolving figure of the Victorian medical professional stepped in, grappling with the complex dilemma of diagnosing and treating restlessness in an era where scientific understanding of sleep was at best a hazy outline. The Victorian era was a crucial period for the professionalization of medicine. Doctors, once often seen as little more than educated quacks, or barbers, were beginning to organize to form professional bodies and to slowly build a more scientific foundation for their practice. Yet for all their growing authority and dedication, their understanding of sleep and its disturbances remained rudimentary. You see, the brain was still largely a black box, its intricate workings a mystery. Sleep itself was often considered a passive state, a temporary cessation of activity rather than the complex dynamic physiological process we now understand it to be. Early theories about sleep still carried echoes of ancient humoral ideas, but new concepts were emerging. Some believed sleep was caused by a reduction of blood flow to the brain, leading to a state of quietude. Others thought it was due to the exhaustion of nerve force or the cessation of animal spirits. You might have a doctor solemnly explaining that your sleeplessness was due to your brain being overcharged with blood, or your nervous energies being depleted. While these theories sound quaint today, they represented an attempt to move beyond purely moralistic explanations. You can't sleep because you're worried about your sins, towards a more physiological understanding, however flawed. When a restless Victorian finally sought medical advice, the diagnostic process would feel strangely familiar, yet profoundly different from today's. The doctor would certainly listen to your complaints, asking about your symptoms, your daily routine, your diet, and your anxieties. They'd likely take your pulse, perhaps check your temperature, and observe your general demeanor. There were no sophisticated brain scans, no polysomnography labs, no sleep studies to pinpoint specific disorders. Diagnosis was largely an art of observation and deduction, mixed with a good deal of intuition and often a firm belief in the physician's own authority. It was less about objective data and more about subjective interpretation. Imagine trying to explain your restless leg syndrome to a Victorian physician. They'd probably just stare intently at you, then prescribe a brisk walk and a good dose of boredom. The classification of sleep disorders was similarly rudimentary. You wouldn't find diagnoses like sleep apnea or narcolepsy. Instead, the pervasive term was insomnia or sleeplessness, often linked to broader conditions like nervous debility or the increasingly fashionable diagnosis of neurasthenia. Neurasthenia, a sort of umbrella term for fatigue, anxiety, depression, and yes, insomnia was thought to be a condition of modern life, brought on by the stresses of rapid industrialization and intellectual overstimulation. It was the Victorian equivalent of being burnt out. The symptom sleeplessness was often treated as a manifestation of these deeper, nervous complaints rather than a primary disorder in itself. So, what kind of treatments would a Victorian doctor prescribe? They often started with the very lifestyle adjustments we discussed. You'd receive stern advice on diet, light suppers, no stimulating drinks, and fresh air, moderate exercise, and regular routines. This advice coming from a figure of authority might have carried more weight than a domestic manual. They would tell you to avoid exciting company or over-intellectual exertion before bed. You might even be told to read a particularly dry medical journal before turning in. Imagine a doctor prescribing a good dose of boredom for your sleepless nights. But beyond lifestyle doctors also ventured into the realm of prescriptions. And here, despite their growing professionalism, they often return to some familiar and dangerous solutions. Laudanum. Our old friend remained a common prescription, albeit often in more controlled measured doses than a patent medicine. Doctors would also prescribe other sedatives that were gaining popularity. Two notable examples are bromides like potassium bromide and chloral hydrate. Bromides were milder sedatives often used for nervous conditions and insomnia, but could lead to bromide intoxication with chronic use. Chloral hydrate, introduced in the late 1860s, was far more potent and quick-acting, often referred to as knockout drops. It was a powerful hypnotic, but also highly addictive and could be fatal in overdose, especially if mixed with alcohol. It offered a rapid route to unconsciousness, making it popular for severe insomnia, but it exchanged one form of danger for another. You might find a patient desperate for sleep, trying to impress their doctor with detailed symptom journals, hoping to get a stronger dose of something. The challenge for these Victorian doctors was immense. They were operating with limited scientific knowledge, often relying on trial and error, and wrestling with the powerful placebo effect and the expectations of their patients. They were treating symptoms, not always understanding the root causes. A doctor might try a tonic in the morning to stimulate the patient and a sedative at night to induce sleep, essentially keeping the patient on a seesaw of chemical manipulation. The best doctors of the era approached their patients with a degree of empathy, but the prevailing medical culture often emphasized authority and a certain detachment. It was less about collaborative healing and more about the doctor dictating a course of action. One particularly quirky tidbit regarding doctor-prescribed remedies involves the use of wet packs or hydrotherapy. While often associated with specialized institutions, some physicians would prescribe simpler forms for home use. This might involve wrapping the patient in cold, wet sheets, often leading to a shivering response, followed by a feeling of warmth and supposedly relaxation and sleep. The theory was that it stimulated circulation and calmed the nerves. While certainly a far cry from modern sleep treatments, it showed a willingness to experiment with physical interventions beyond simply ingesting a chemical. One can only imagine the sheer discomfort of being wrapped in cold, wet linen in a drafty Victorian bedroom hoping for sleep. A significant mainstream historical fact from this period is that the Victorian era was a critical period for the professionalization of medicine, which began to classify and treat sleep disturbances, though their understanding remained rudimentary. Doctors started compiling observations, trying to link symptoms to causes, and attempting to build a coherent framework for understanding and treating insomnia. This laid the essential groundwork for future neurological and sleep research, even if their initial steps were often faltering. Historians debate the extent to which Victorian medical understanding of sleep was genuinely scientific, or if it remained largely influenced by moralistic and societal biases. Did doctors truly apply a scientific method, or were their diagnoses and treatments still colored by prevailing social norms about idleness, nervousness, or gender roles, as we'll see with hysteria later? It's a complex interplay. While some doctors were genuine pioneers pushing the boundaries of physiological understanding, others might have simply reinforced existing prejudices, prescribing rest to nervous women and work to lazy men. You can almost picture a doctor secretly trying to figure out which patent medicine was least harmful while still looking authoritative. So, the Victorian doctor, a figure of increasing authority in society, found themselves at the forefront of the battle against sleeplessness. Armed with limited knowledge, a growing but imperfect toolkit of treatments, and a public desperate for relief, they navigated a complex landscape of emerging science and entrenched beliefs. Their attempts, though sometimes crude and even dangerous, marked a crucial step in the journey towards understanding sleep as a medical phenomenon. But what happened when even the doctor's prescriptions weren't enough, when severe chronic cases of nervous exhaustion demanded more than a simple visit? Our gentle journey now takes us to the more structured and often isolated world of Victorian sanitariums, and the surprisingly popular yet often controversial practice of hydrotherapy. You've witnessed the Victorians' varied, sometimes alarming attempts to conquer sleeplessness, from herbal whispers to the cold shock of hydrotherapy. But as you sift through the remnants of their restless nights, a particular thread emerges, one that weaves itself predominantly through the experiences of half the population: the pervasive, often debilitating world of nervous disorders and hysteria, maladies disproportionately and often vaguely linked to the Victorian woman and her elusive sleep. Imagine a grand, imposing building nestled amidst rolling hills or beside a tranquil lake, far removed from the clamor of the city. This was the typical setting for a Victorian sanitarium, a specialized institution designed not for the severely mentally ill those went to asylums, but for those suffering from nervous exhaustion, neurasthenia, and of course, intractable insomnia. These were places of enforced calm, designed to remove the patient from the stresses of their daily lives and immerse them in an environment of rest, fresh air, healthy diet, and rigorous routine. It was a bit like a luxury prison for the tired if your idea of luxury involved being told exactly what to do and when to do it. At the heart of the sanitarium experience, particularly for those suffering from chronic sleeplessness and nervous agitation, was a treatment that became a mainstream historical fact: the rest cure. Popularized by the American physician S. Weir Mitchell in the late 19th century, this was an intensive, often controversial regimen particularly applied to women. You, as the patient, would be subjected to strict bed rest, sometimes for weeks or even months. You were often isolated from family and friends, forbidden from reading, writing, or engaging in any stimulating intellectual activity. Your meals would be brought to you, often consisting of rich, calorie-dense foods, milk, cream, sometimes even raw meat extracts to combat the emaciation that often accompanied chronic illness. Massage, often combined with light electrical stimulation galvanism, was also a key component intended to prevent muscle atrophy and stimulate circulation. The idea was to completely remove all external stimuli, allowing the overtaxed nervous system to rebuild itself like a computer, undergoing a hard reset. Alongside, or often integrated with, the rest cure was the pervasive and fascinating practice of hydrotherapy, or the water cure. This wasn't just about a nice warm bath before bed. This was a rigorous, often shocking application of water in various temperatures and forms, believed to purify the body, stimulate the nerves, and restore balance. The Victorians truly believed in the power of water, and sanitariums often boasted elaborate bathing facilities. You might be prescribed a series of cold baths, plunges into icy water intended to shock the system and invigorate the circulation, or perhaps a wet sheet pack, where you'd be wrapped tightly in cold, wet sheets, then covered in blankets to induce a sweating response followed by a period of relaxation. There were douches, high-pressure sprays of water directed at specific parts of the body believed to stimulate nerves and muscles. You might experience sitz baths, where only the hips and abdomen were immersed, or compresses, applied to specific areas. The theory was that the application of water, particularly cold water, could draw out impurities, strengthen the nervous system, and normalize circulation, thus promoting natural restorative sleep. Imagine trying to convince a modern person exhausted from their day to take a cold bath as therapy. Just jump in, it'll shock you into relaxation. The daily routine in a Victorian sanitarium was meticulously structured, leaving little room for individual agency. You would rise early, often at dawn, for a cold sponge bath or a brisk walk in the grounds. Meals were taken at precise times, and every hour of the day might be accounted for with scheduled treatments, periods of rest, or light supervised activity. This rigid discipline was believed to be part of the cure, fostering order and regularity in minds that had become disordered by the stresses of modern life. It was a far cry from the chaotic, self-medicating existence many patients had experienced outside. The bland but medically beneficial food served in these institutions probably tasted quite refreshing after a lifetime of rich Victorian fare, but you wouldn't be writing home about the culinary delights. The patient experience within these institutions was varied. For some, especially those from chaotic or stressful home environments, the enforced rest, nutritious food, and removal from daily pressures offered genuine respite and physical improvement. They might indeed emerge feeling more rested and capable. But for others, particularly those subjected to the extreme isolation of the rest cure, it was a frustrating and sometimes dehumanizing incarceration. You were essentially stripped of your autonomy, your will suppressed in the name of health. The famous American writer Charlotte Perkins Gilman herself, a patient of S. Weir Mitchell, famously rebelled against the rest cure, depicting its suffocating effects in her chilling short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, where the enforced idleness and intellectual starvation nearly drove her to madness. It underscores the profound ethical debate that surrounds this practice. Indeed, historians continue to debate the ethical implications and long-term efficacy of the rest cure, particularly its disproportionate application to women, and whether it was genuinely therapeutic or a form of social control. Was it a legitimate medical treatment for nervous conditions? Or was it a convenient way for a patriarchal society to silence and control women who deviated from expected norms, labeling their ambition or unhappiness as nervous debility, curable by enforced idleness? The fact that male patients were often prescribed the work cure, vigorous exercise and outdoor activity rather than rest, adds another layer to this complex scholarly discussion. It makes you wonder if doctors were literally throwing cold water on you as a cure, or just as a way to assert their authority. Despite these ethical questions, the rest cure and hydrotherapy represent a significant, widely practiced mainstream historical fact. They formed the bedrock of institutional treatment for nervous disorders and chronic insomnia during the Victorian era. While their scientific basis was often shaky, they offered a structured environment that at the very least ensured physical rest, good nutrition, and removal from external stressors for many patients. The fact that patients often gained weight and looked healthier upon discharge was often taken as proof of the cure's success, even if the underlying mental anguish remained. Imagine a patient trying to sneak out of a sanitarium for a brisk, forbidden jog, just to prove they weren't entirely nervous. So while the harsh realities of Victorian life pushed many to the brink of exhaustion and sleeplessness, the sanitarium offered a radical totalizing solution. It was a testament to the era's belief in the power of environment and strict regimen, even if it came with a hefty price tag and a distinct lack of personal freedom. As you continue to ease into this history, you'll find that these nervous disorders, particularly for women, were a pervasive thread constantly intertwined with the quest for sleep. Our next gentle exploration will delve deeper into the specific ways Victorian society categorized and treated these female maladies and their profound connection to the agitated, sleepless mind. You've witnessed the Victorians' varied, sometimes alarming attempts to conquer sleeplessness, from herbal whispers to the cold shock of hydrotherapy. But as you sift through the remnants of their restless nights, a particular thread emerges, one that weaves itself predominantly through the experiences of half the population: the pervasive, often debilitating world of nervous disorders and hysteria, maladies disproportionately and often vaguely linked to the Victorian woman and her elusive sleep. This was an era defined by strict gender roles, especially within the burgeoning middle and upper classes. Women were largely confined to the domestic sphere, expected to embody virtues of purity, piety, submissiveness, and domesticity. Their intellectual and creative outlets were often severely limited their lives, circumscribed by social etiquette and the demands of the household. Imagine your great-great-grandmother navigating a world where leaning in meant literally fainting in a corset, where her sphere of influence was meticulously delineated by lace curtains and tea parties. This societal framework, while outwardly orderly, placed immense pressure on women, creating a breeding ground for a host of psychological and physical complaints that doctors often lumped under the catch-all diagnosis of nerves. At the heart of this complex issue was the diagnosis of hysteria, a term with roots stretching back to ancient Greece, where it was believed to originate from a wandering womb. The Greek word hystera means uterus. In the Victorian era, hysteria became a mainstream historical fact, a remarkably prevalent, if bewilderingly broad diagnosis applied to women exhibiting a vast array of symptoms. These could include anything from fainting spells, paralysis headaches, and digestive problems, to emotional volatility, anxiety, depression, and crucially for our discussion, chronic insomnia and disturbing nightmares. It was a diagnostic black hole. If a woman presented with any unexplained physical or emotional distress, it was often attributed to her inherently delicate or overwrought female nervous system. It was the Victorian equivalent of she's just being emotional, but with a medical certificate attached. The connection between these female maladies and sleep was profound. Insomnia was not merely a symptom. It was often seen as both a cause and effect of the agitated nervous system. A sleepless night would exacerbate the nerves, and nervousness would in turn prevent sleep. Women already struggling with the pressures of their confined lives found their anxieties amplified in the quiet hours of the night. Their dreams might be troubled, filled with unspoken frustrations, or the shadowy fears of their constrained existence bleeding into restless, wakeful hours. It's almost as if having too many feelings was considered a medical condition, and the only cure was, often more feelings. The treatments for these female nerves and their accompanying sleeplessness varied and often reflected the prevailing, often patriarchal medical attitudes. The rest cure, which we discussed in the previous section, was overwhelmingly applied to women. The rationale was that women's delicate nervous systems were simply too fragile for the demands of modern life or intellectual exertion, and thus required complete enforced idleness. As Charlotte Perkins Gilman painfully illustrated for intelligent, active women, this cure could be its own form of torture, leading to further mental anguish, and ironically more sleepless nights born of frustration and confinement. It was a peculiar kind of medical reasoning. You're tired because you're a woman, so we'll make you more tired by doing nothing at all. Beyond the rest, cure some truly bizarre and ethically questionable treatments for hysteria were employed. One particularly notorious method was pelvic massage, or manual manipulation, performed by male physicians. The idea was to bring the patient to paroxysm, a hysterical orgasm to relieve her symptoms. This was seen as a medical procedure, albeit one with a clearly sexual component that thankfully led to the invention of mechanical vibrators, which later moved out of the doctor's office and into other places. It's a quirky tidbit that underlines the profoundly strange intersection of Victorian medicine sexuality and the treatment of female disorders. Imagine a doctor prescribing more corsets and less thinking for your nervous disposition, followed by something even more uncomfortable. For less extreme cases, or for home-use tonic wines and elixirs specifically marketed to women for their nerves, were rampant. These often contained significant amounts of alcohol opiates like laudanum or bromides, providing temporary sedation and a false sense of calm. Mother's Friend, Dr. Pierce's favorite prescription, and countless others promised to soothe the overwrought female system. These were particularly dangerous, fostering dependence under the guise of gentle relief. Sedatives like bromides and chloral hydrate, which we met in the previous section, were also commonly prescribed to calm agitated nerves and induce sleep, often without full understanding of their addictive properties or side effects. It was a vicious cycle of prescribing drugs to manage symptoms, which often led to new problems. Scholars continue to debate the extent to which Victorian diagnoses of female maladies like hysteria genuinely reflected physiological conditions, or served as a medicalization of social discontent and patriarchal control. Was it truly a distinct medical condition? Or was it a convenient label applied to women who expressed discontent with their limited roles? experienced genuine mental health struggles like anxiety or depression that weren't understood or simply sought escape from an oppressive reality. The fact that male complaints of stress and fatigue were often diagnosed as neurasthenia and treated with invigorating work cures, while women received rest cures for hysteria. He suggests a strong gender bias in diagnosis and treatment. It makes you wonder if every Victorian problem eventually led back to a vague uterine issue in the medical textbooks. A particularly poignant, quirky tidbit comes from the personal writings of Victorian women. Many diaries and letters contain references to my nerves acting up or a bad spell of hysteria, often followed by mentions of taking a calming draft or feeling weak. These entries speak to the lived experience of these vague diagnoses and the internal struggles faced by women who were often encouraged to be delicate and emotional, yet then pathologized for embodying these very traits. It's almost as if a Victorian woman had to feign an illness just to get a respectable nap in a world that demanded constant silent activity. The mainstream historical fact is undeniable. Hysteria was a prevalent, often vaguely defined diagnosis in Victorian medicine, disproportionately applied to women, and its symptoms, including insomnia, were often treated with controversial methods. This highlights not only the limited medical understanding of the time, but also the profound influence of societal norms and gender expectations on medical practice. The struggle for sleep for women was thus intertwined with their broader struggle for autonomy and recognition as complete, capable individuals. As you reflect on the unique challenges faced by Victorian women in their quest for sleep, you realize that the remedies offered were often as much a reflection of societal control as they were of genuine therapeutic intent. The agitated female mind, prevented from engaging fully with the world, often found its anxieties expressed in restless nights. But adults weren't the only ones suffering from sleep woes. Our gentle journey continues, leading us into the surprisingly complex and sometimes alarming world of children's sleep remedies, where innocence met the very same chemical solutions and societal pressures that plagued their parents. You've seen the sleepless struggles of Victorian adults from the factory floor to the drawing room, and even the unique anxieties that plagued Victorian women. But as you continue your quiet drift through history, spare a thought for the most vulnerable among them, the children. For Victorian parents, a child's slumber was not merely a convenience. It was often a desperate necessity. The challenges were immense: teething pains, colic, childhood illnesses, and simply the natural fussiness of infants. In a world without modern analgesics, antibiotics, or even basic pediatric understanding, a crying, sleepless child could push a household, and particularly a mother, to the brink. And it was in this crucible of desperation that some of the most alarming yet tragically common Victorian sleep remedies found their unwitting, tiny consumers. You see, the Victorian era, despite its romanticized image, was a tough time for children. Infant mortality rates were shockingly high, and childhood was often short and brutal. There was less sentimentality about childhood as a protected, idyllic phase than there is today. Societal expectations demanded quiet, well-behaved children, and the pressure on mothers often isolated in their homes without modern support networks was immense. A persistent wail, a feverish cough, a child who simply would not sleep. These were not just inconveniences, but sources of profound stress and exhaustion for parents. Contrast that with modern parents spending hours on sleep training apps or debating the merits of different white noise machines. The Victorians had a simpler but far more dangerous solution. This solution, a mainstream historical fact that chills modern sensibilities, came in the form of opium-based soothing syrups and other sedatives widely and freely given to Victorian infants and children. These weren't subtle elixirs. They were potent concoctions designed to silence a screaming child, often with immediate profound effect. You'd walk into any apothecary, general store, or even a local market and find shelves lined with brightly labeled bottles, marketed specifically for teething troubles, colic, or restless nights for infants. Brands like Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup, Godfrey's Cordial, and Daffy's Elixir were household names advertised as safe, gentle, and miraculously effective at bringing peace to even the most fractious babe. But what was in these seemingly benign bottles? Unbeknownst to most parents, they were laden with opium, morphine, laudanum, opium dissolved in alcohol. Remember that, and often additional alcohol. The ingredients were rarely, if ever, fully disclosed or were listed in vague, misleading terms. A typical bottle of Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup care, for example, was essentially a solution of morphine sulfate and alcohol. Giving it to an infant, even in seemingly small doses, was akin to giving a modern baby a strong adult painkiller mixed with whiskey. The effect was undeniable. The child would fall into a deep, often unnaturally quiet sleep. Parents exhausted and desperate for relief would interpret this as a miraculous cure, unaware that they were sedating their children with potent narcotics. You could almost hear the marketing slogan, "Guaranteed quiet or your baby may never wake up," and which was tragically sometimes true. The consequences were devastating. Accidental overdoses were distressingly common, leading to untold numbers of infant deaths, often simply attributed to wasting or failure to thrive in an era of high child mortality. Children who survived regular dosing often suffered from chronic opiate dependence from infancy, exhibiting lethargy, developmental delays, malnutrition, and the telltale signs of withdrawal if deprived of their daily dose. Imagine a Victorian baby seemingly sleeping like a perfectly still, possibly very medicated log, while its parents finally caught a few hours of uneasy rest. It wasn't just patent medicines. Alcohol in various forms was sometimes given directly to children to quiet them or ease pain. A drop of gin rubbed on the gums for teething, or a few drops of brandy mixed with water, were not uncommon practices believed to have soothing properties. While some parents might also resort to more traditional methods like rocking lullabies or warm milk, a gentle callback to Section 2, the sheer efficacy and accessibility of the opiate syrups often made them the preferred if unwitting choice for truly desperate parents. The underlying issue was not parental malevolence, but a profound ignorance coupled with sheer exhaustion. Parents genuinely believed these remedies were safe and beneficial. They were simply doing the best they could with the limited knowledge and resources available. The medical understanding of child physiology and drug effects was virtually non-existent. Pediatrics was still in its infancy, and the idea of child-specific dosages or the long-term impact of narcotics on a developing brain was simply not understood. It's a sobering reminder of a time when the line between medicine and poison was often blurred, especially for the youngest members of society. You can only imagine what would happen if a modern child protective services agent stumbled upon a Victorian nursery and witnessed their bedtime routine. One particularly poignant and quirky tidbit comes from advertisements themselves. Some soothing syrup ads would depict plump, rosy-cheeked babies sleeping peacefully, implying perfect health. Yet the reality for many children regularly dosed with opiates was quite different. Pallid complexions, listlessness, and stunted growth. The contrast between the idealized image and the grim reality is stark. It speaks to the power of advertising and the desperate hope of parents. You might even hear anecdotes of a Victorian playdate involving a suspiciously quiet, unnervingly still group of toddlers, all gently sedated by their well-meaning caregivers. This widespread use of opium-based soothing syrups for children is a crucial mainstream historical fact, highlighting the dark side of unregulated medicine and the immense pressures faced by Victorian families. It was a silent crisis hidden in plain sight with devastating consequences for the health and development of countless children. It reveals a complex interplay of scientific ignorance, societal demands, and parental desperation where the very act of seeking relief inadvertently caused profound harm. Historians continue to debate the exact prevalence of childhood opiate dependence, given the normalization of soothing syrups and the high rates of infant mortality from unspecified causes. It's difficult to quantify how many childhood deaths attributed to wasting or convulsions were in fact accidental opiate overdoses or complications from chronic dependence. The casualness with which these substances were administered means comprehensive records are scarce, leaving us with a chilling ambiguity about the true scale of this tragic phenomenon. So, as the Victorian child drifted off to a medicated slumber, the world outside continued its frantic pace. The remedies they sought, whether for adults or children, were often reflections of their societal pressures and scientific limitations. But beyond the practicalities of sleep and its elusive pursuit, how did this pervasive struggle manifest in the broader culture? Our final journey through the Victorian night will explore how sleep or its unsettling absence was portrayed in their literature, art, and popular culture, offering a window into the collective consciousness of a restless age. You've seen the Victorians wrestle with sleep on a deeply personal, often desperate level, from their restless nights to the alarming remedies they employed for themselves and their children. But beyond the quiet confines of the bedroom and the doctor's consulting room, how did this pervasive struggle manifest in the broader cultural landscape? As you gently drift towards the close of our historical journey, we turn our gaze to the artistic echoes of the era, exploring how sleep or its unsettling absence was portrayed in Victorian literature, art, and popular culture, offering a fascinating window into the collective consciousness of a restless age. You see, art and literature are often profound mirrors reflecting the anxieties, fascinations, and daily realities of the societies that produce them. Now, the Victorians, steeped in rapid industrialization, moral strictures, and emergent scientific understanding, found ample material for their creative endeavors in the mysterious realm of sleep and its discontents. This became a mainstream historical fact. Victorian literature and art frequently explored themes of sleep dreams, sleeplessness, and the effects of narcotics, reflecting the era's widespread anxieties and experiences. In the realm of literature, the poets were often at the forefront of exploring altered states. We've touched on Samuel Taylor Coleridge before, whose epic Kubla Khan is famously said to have been composed in an opium dream, only to be interrupted before its completion. His struggles with opium addiction, a poignant callback, made him an unwitting chronicler of the drug's grip. But it was Thomas de Quincey's Confessions of an English Opium Eater, 1821, published just before the Victorian era proper, but deeply influential within it, that truly brought the private world of drug-induced altered states into public discourse. His vivid, often terrifying descriptions of opium's effects on sleep dreams and waking life fascinated and horrified readers, shaping the popular imagination of the opium eater. I It was less a cautionary tale and more a sensational expose, and frankly a much more exciting read than a typical Victorian novel, which could sometimes cure insomnia just by existing. Beyond the Romantics, Gothic literature, a genre that flourished in the Victorian era, often used sleep as a potent symbolic device. Sleep was portrayed as a state of profound vulnerability, a gateway to the subconscious, or even a conduit for a supernatural malevolence. Think of the helpless victims in vampire novels like Dracula falling into a trance-like sleep, or the disturbed dreams that plague characters in Frankenstein and other tales of horror. Nightmares, often seen as manifestations of a troubled soul or external evil, became a popular motif. These stories played on the primal fear of losing control of the waking world, seeping into your most vulnerable moments of rest. You probably shouldn't read a Victorian Gothic novel right before trying to fall asleep, unless you're aiming for a productive night of internal screaming. Social realist novels, meanwhile, depicted the raw, grinding exhaustion of the working classes. Authors like Charles Dickens filled their pages with characters utterly worn out by relentless labor and urban squalor, their sleep fitful and often interrupted by noise, hunger, or despair. These were not the romanticized opium dreams of poets, but the grim reality of bodies pushed to their limits, where sleep was less a luxury and more a battle against physical and mental fatigue. And then there were the nervous women of Victorian fiction, mirroring the real-life struggles we discussed. Literary heroines frequently suffered from nerves vapors and bouts of debilitating insomnia, often depicted as a consequence of their constrained lives, thwarted ambitions, or oppressive domestic circumstances. Think of the intense inner lives and psychological turmoil of Charlotte Bronte's characters, whose emotional distress often manifested in sleepless nights. These literary portrayals cemented the archetype of the fragile, restless Victorian lady, perpetually on the verge of a breakdown. It was almost as if characters in novels were constantly having the vapors, or nerves, and it was always attributed to being too delicate for the world, never to the fact that they hadn't slept in a week. In the visual arts, too, sleep found its expression. The pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, with their emphasis on intense emotionality and symbolic detail, often depicted figures in languid, dreamlike states, or appearing to be lost in contemplation that bordered on slumber. John Everett Malace's Ophelia, floating ethereally in water, exemplifies this sense of a passive, almost sleep-like surrender. Other paintings might show figures resting sometimes peacefully, sometimes with a haunted expression reflecting the varied nature of Victorian sleep. Illustrations in popular magazines and newspapers, meanwhile, often took a more direct approach depicting the weary faces of insomniacs or the seemingly miraculous transformation brought about by patent medicines, often with exaggerated, almost cartoonish expressions of relief. You could spot a painting and immediately think, yep, that person needs a nap, and probably less mercury. The symbolism of sleep in Victorian art and literature was rich and multi-layered. It represented peace and escape from worldly troubles, a respite from suffering. But it also symbolized vulnerability, a surrender to the unknown, where nightmares and subconscious fears could hold sway. Sometimes it even hinted at death of final permanent slumber. Even in popular culture, in the ballads sung in public houses or the simple folk songs of the working-class themes of troubled sleep were present. These might be direct laments about sleepless nights caused by poverty or unrequited love, or more fantastical tales of dreams and omens. Moral tales prevalent in children's literature and Sunday school pamphlets often emphasize the importance of proper rest as part of a virtuous life, or warned against the dangers of idleness or vice leading to sleeplessness. And of course, the language of the ubiquitous medical pamphlets and advertising for sleep aids often bled into popular discourse, turning hyperbolic marketing slogans into a kind of darkly humorous poetry. A particularly quirky tidbit was the fascination with dream interpretation guides that proliferated during this period. These small books, often cheaply printed, offered readers a chance to decipher the hidden meanings of their troubled nocturnal visions. From the symbolism of a falling tooth to the appearance of a black cat, every dream element was given a neat, often superstitious explanation. It reflected a deep desire to find meaning in their restless nights, to exert some control over the terrifying or confusing landscapes of their subconscious. It's almost like their lullabies were secretly just lists of medical symptoms set to a tune. Ultimately, the cultural reflections of Victorian sleep reveal a profound tension between an idealized vision of peaceful slumber, the calm, undisturbed rest essential for body and soul, and the often troubled, restless, and medicated reality of daily life. The art and literature of the period serve as a collective dream diary, chronicling an age struggling to find peace amidst unprecedented change. Literary scholars continue to debate the extent to which Victorian authors consciously used literary depictions of sleeplessness and opium use as social commentary, or merely as reflections of personal experience and popular sensationalism. Was it a deliberate critique of industrial society or simply a captivating way to explore the human condition? Likely both intertwined as always. As you awaken from this final exploration of the Victorian night, you begin to connect the threads, the desperate search for rest, the dubious remedies, the evolving medical understanding, and the cultural reverberations. You realize that the Victorians, for all their differences, faced many of the same fundamental struggles with sleep that we do today. This brings us gently to the very end of our journey, as we reflect on how their pioneering, often perilous attempts to court slumber laid the foundation for our modern understanding, and sometimes our modern struggles with the elusive gift of sleep. You've traversed the complex, often perplexing landscape of Victorian sleep aids and remedies. You've witnessed the tireless pursuit of slumber, from herbal concoctions to potent chemicals, from hypnotic gazes to bizarre machines, and from strict routines to institutionalized rest. As you stir gently from this historical reverie, you begin to connect the threads, realizing that the Victorians, for all their differences, faced many of the same fundamental struggles with sleep that we do today. This brings us quietly to the very end of our journey, as we reflect on how their pioneering, often perilous attempts to court slumber laid the foundation for our modern understanding, and sometimes our modern struggles with the elusive gift of sleep. The echoes are undeniable. Think back to the clamor of the Industrial Revolution, the relentless pace of urban life, the anxieties of a rapidly changing world that kept Victorian minds from finding peace. Does that sound familiar today? We might replace the clatter of the factory with the incessant ping of notifications, the gaslight with the blue glow of screens, and the stress of moral rectitude with the pressures of constant connectivity and FOMO. The underlying problem, an overstimulated mind in a world that never truly switches off, remains strikingly similar. It's almost as if the only major difference between us and them is our Wi Fi, which, let's be honest, probably makes our sleep worse, not better. But the Victorians, in their earnest efforts, unwittingly laid crucial groundwork. Remember those gentle home remedies: chamomile tea, warm milk, the emphasis on fresh air and a cool bedroom, light suppers before bed. These very principles of sleep hygiene, callback to Section 9, are still advocated by sleep experts today. While their scientific rationale might have been rooted in miasma theory rather than circadian rhythms, their practical advice often hits surprisingly close to the mark. So, when you brew a mug of herbal tea tonight, know that you're partaking in a tradition that stretches back centuries long before anyone understood melatonin. Then there were the patent medicines, that wild west of unregulated elixirs. While today you're unlikely to find opium in your cough syrup, the spirit of the quick fix symptom masking pharmaceutical persists. However, the Victorian era, through its public health crises, callback to Section 3, and Section 5, ultimately catalyzed the need for regulation. The dark consequences of unlabeled opiates and dangerous chemicals led to the eventual establishment of food and drug laws, ingredient transparency, and the rigorous testing that, while imperfect, now governs our modern pharmaceutical industry. It's why your doctor needs a prescription, unlike the free-for-all laudanum market. A Victorian would probably faint clean away if they saw the endless warning labels on a modern bottle of aspirin, let alone a sleep aid. Speaking of opiates and sedatives, the Victorian experience profoundly shaped our understanding of addiction. What began as a habit or nervous condition, callback to Section 5, gradually gained recognition as a serious medical problem. This realization, hard won through widespread suffering, spurred the development of more targeted, though still problematic, hypnotics later in the 20th century, like barbiturates and benzodiazepines. These, in turn, have led to our current, more nuanced understanding of sleep medication, emphasizing careful prescription and short-term use, a direct lineage from those early dangerous experiments with chloral hydrate. Call back to Section 10. It turns out modern medicine has better options for everything than mercury and raw opium, which is a definite win. The mind-body connection explored theatrically through mesmerism and hypnotism. Callback to Section 7 also left an enduring legacy. While the swinging pocket watches and animal magnetism might seem quaint, these practices represented an early, if crude, recognition of the power of suggestion and the subconscious mind. This laid the foundation for modern psychotherapy, mindfulness-based stress reduction, and cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, CBTI, techniques that use psychological tools, not just chemicals, to help you understand and manage your sleep. A Victorian mesmerist would probably be amazed by a modern sleep study, but they'd recognize the core idea of altering states of consciousness for therapeutic gain. Even the bizarre mechanical gadgets callback to Section 8 have their modern descendants. While you won't find a head-compressing device on Amazon, thankfully, the concept of using technology to aid sleep persists. Think of white noise machines, specialized sleep apps that track your cycles, smart beds that adjust firmness, or even high-tech massage chairs designed to relax you. Our modern sleep tech often sounds like a Victorian inventor's wildest, most technologically advanced, and probably most profitable dreams. Perhaps the most significant legacy is the evolution of medical understanding itself. From viewing sleep as a passive state, doctors slowly began to unravel its complexities. While Victorian physicians made rudimentary observations, call back to Section 10, their efforts were the nascent steps towards modern sleep science, with its discoveries of REM sleep stages and the intricate neurobiology of rest. The biased, often gendered diagnoses of hysteria, call back to Section 12, have also thankfully been critiqued and largely abandoned, leading to more inclusive and scientifically grounded approaches to mental health for all genders. We're still trying to escape reality sometimes, just with better apps and less risk of poisoning. Despite all this progress, the enduring problem of insomnia, the elusive nature of a truly restful night, remains. Our always on culture, the pressures of work, and the sheer volume of information vying for our attention mean that many of us still struggle to switch off. In a way, we are all still searching for that perfect liquid lullaby, that calming balm, that quiet sanctuary that the Victorians sought so desperately. The lessons learned from their pioneering, sometimes perilous attempts, the value of scientific regulation, the wisdom of holistic approaches, and the profound impact of societal conditions on individual well being continue to guide our quest for the sweet restorative gift of slumber. Historians continue to debate whether our modern sleep crisis is a continuation of Victorian industrial pressures or a new phenomenon driven by digital technologies and constant connectivity. It's a fascinating question, a quirky tidbit for your own late night pondering. And now, as our gentle journey through the history of Victorian sleep aids and remedies draws to a close, allow your own body to soften. The gaslights of the past are fading, replaced by the quiet glow of your own space. The distant clatter of Victorian industry, the whispers of anxious minds, and the rustle of forgotten remedies are all receding into the quietude of history. You've explored a fascinating chapter in humanity's endless quest for rest, and perhaps in doing so, you found a deeper appreciation for the simple, profound peace that sleep offers. Let your eyelids grow heavy, your breath deepen, and feel the gentle pull towards your own quiet slumber. There is nothing more to learn, nothing more to do, just the soft descent into comforting darkness. Drift now softly, peacefully. End of script. Sweet dreams.